communism, Marxism, socialism, it's all racist because the guy who came up with it is racist. And those are the rules, that if the person's racist, then all their creations are racist no matter what it is. This is the Culture War Encyclopedia. See the link below for that. And if you scroll down, it's all alphabetical. If you go to Marx, down here, Marx, Karl, and click on it, you get what we are going to cover today. Karl Marx, quote, "One of the pleasures in recent years has been watching people who think they are being a good liberal boundary keeper discover that one of their feet has nicked one of the tripwires," unquote. Douglas Murray in The Madness of Crowds, Gender, Race, and Identity, 2019, page 241, that quote is from. And here you can see a photograph of a memorial, or I think it's actually a grave, to Karl Marx that has been vandalized. Sorry, Marxists, socialists, and communists, you're all racist. According to your own rules, you see, Karl Marx was racist, and so Marxism/socialism/communism is racist too, right? In his book, The War on the West, 2022, Douglas Murray discusses many examples of the destruction of public monuments and statues in the West in recent years. Some were once iconic but became historic relics as society changed its position on things like the treatment of American Indians and slavery. Some remained iconic, being that they never did represent such injustices but were destroyed just the same in recent years. I provide what Murray writes about these examples under iconoclasm in the Culture War Encyclopedia. There, by the way, is the book that we're going to quote mostly from today. There's Engels on the left and Marx on the right. Marx and then Engels and then Lenin. Murray also points out some hypocritical inconsistencies in all this, for you see, icons for the left, such as Michel Foucault, and Karl Marx, are excused for their bigotry because, well, they are icons for the left. On pages 174 to 181 of The War on the West, Douglas Murray writes, quote, "Why do their gods not fall? Yet there are many oddities in all of this. Kant, Hume, Jefferson, Mill, Voltaire, and everyone else connected to racism, empire, or slavery must fall, and yet a strange selection of historical figures does not. And in this fact we get to the root, or roots, of something that is happening in the anti-Western moment. The Highgate in London, one of the largest monuments in the cemetery, is a great bust on top of a huge stone pillar. On the front are quotes from the Communist Manifesto. Quote, "Workers of all lands unite." And from the Thesis on Feuerbach, "The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it." The man whose tomb this is of course Karl Marx. To this day, it remains a place of pilgrimage for people who think that Marx changed the world in a good way. All have their own spin for dealing with the fact that of the roughly 100 million people who were killed in trying to change the world along Marx's lines. Yet it stands there still, and there have been no serious efforts to topple it or destroy the bust. Occasionally has been daubed in red paint, with such vandalism always condemned by cultural and political figures alike, but through the events of recent years, there have been no online petitions or crowd efforts to pull it down or kick it into a nearby river, unlike things that we cover in the series on iconoclasm. Plenty of statues of people who never owned slaves, who never expressed anything racist, being kicked into rivers and whatnot. Murray continues, "Yet the monument in Highgate is not the only memorial to Marx or Marxism that stands. As recent as 2016, Stafford University unveiled a new memorial on its campus. The huge bust of Friedrich Engels, co-author of the Communist Manifesto, was made into a feature of campus life, in part to commemorate the fact that Marx and Engels used to drink in a nearby pub when they lived in the area in the 1840s. The university authorities paid for the vast 5-meter-tall sculpture as a tribute to the two men. As recently as 2018, on the 200th anniversary of his birth, A vast new, larger-than-life statue of Marx was unveiled in the town of Trier, if I'm saying that correctly, probably not, in the southwest of Germany, just near the borders with Luxembourg, Belgium, and France. The 14-foot tall bronze statue was donated by the authorities in China, and hundreds of guests at the unveiling included a delegation from the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP. It seems as though a connection with Marx or Marxism is no ethical problem, perhaps even a plus. In April 2021, when students at the University of Liverpool forced the university authorities to rename a building named after the 19th century Prime Minister William Gladstone because of his father's links with slavery, the sins of the father. They renamed the hall after a civil rights campaigner and lifelong Communist Party member called Dorothy Kuya, unquote. Now, I found this photo of that statue they're speaking of, and this is from a source called something called Karl Marx, greatest philosopher and revolutionary of all time, 200 years on. And it is captioned as thus: Chinese artist Wu Weishan, I guess, poses next to his 4.4 meter or 14 feet high bronze statue of Karl Marx, donated by China to mark the 200th birth anniversary of the German philosopher in his hometown Trier, Germany, 5th of May 2018. Photo by Reuters. And yeah, there you go. And then you have this right here. This is not the same. Well, is it the same one? Because look, it looks the same. Yes, it is. Good look. Same background, right? And I'm getting this from the same source. However, this one here says, what is it here? In Chemnitz, Germany. Oh, I see that. Okay, I see what they're saying. The demonstration is there. But there you go. Now, this boggles the mind. Here you have Germany, an entire culture who for decades are like, we're sorry about being Nazis. We'll never do that again. Right? So they're sorry about being National Socialists. And here they are celebrating socialism / Marxism / communism. And it being donated by a very authoritarian state. The party, the CCP. Wow. Like, we'll never do that again while they're actually celebrating, you know, at least some Germans. This isn't the majority of Germans, to give them credit, but enough so that they can have these things standing in their city. You know, they allow that to happen, you know. And I'm not saying tear it down, I'm not saying vandalize it, but I'm saying, why did you put that up? That's horrible. Anyway, what is this one here? Same source. This one is captioned, a statue of philosopher and revolutionary Karl Marx stands in a public park, 4th of May 2018 in Berlin, Germany. So different statue there. That's what I was thinking of. But this is clearly two photos of the same statue. All right. So Murray goes on to write, quote, there is no special effort to eradicate, problematize, decolonize, or otherwise act in an, quote, anti-racist, unquote, matter against the legacy of Karl Marx and his circle. And this is strange because, as anybody who has read the work of Marx will know, especially anyone who has read his letters with Engels, Marx's reputation by the lights of our own age ought to be toast by now. Consider the racism in Marx's letter to Engels, where the two great communists converse privately about the issues of their day. Here's a letter from Marx to Engels written July 1862. Quote, the Jewish N-word... He didn't actually write N-word. You know what I'm saying here, folks. I mean, this is on YouTube, so I can't say certain things. The, quote, the Jewish N-word LaSalle, who I'm glad to say is leaving at the end of this week, has happily lost another 5,000 thalers in an ill-judged speculation. It is now quite plain to me, as the shape of his head and the way his hair grows also testify that he is descended from the Negroes who accompanied Moses' flight from Egypt, unless his mother or paternal grandmother interbred with a N-word. Now this, oh boy.
Wow.
Now this, yeah.
Classy.
Right? Now, this blend of Jewishness and Germanness on the one hand and basic Negroid stock on the other must inevitably give rise to peculiar product. The fellow's importunity is also N-word-like. And at that point, Douglas Murray puts the following footnote. You can see right there. He's quoting Karl Marx to Frederick Engels, July 30th, 1862. Marx and in the book or a source called Marx and Engels Collected Works, Volume 41, published 1984, page 388. Murray goes on, of course, this is not a nice way to speak about anybody, but but charitable interpretations, such as has been denied to David Hume, might say that this is just one ugly thing said by Marx in a private letter, and that we shouldn't judge him harshly on it. Yet this is not the only occasion that such a sentiment came from Marx's pen. Here is another letter to Engels, written 4 years later, 1866, in which Marx described a recent work he believes Engels might benefit from. By this stage, both men are aware of the discoveries of Charles Darwin, whose work on the origin of the species, origins of the species? I think I wrote that wrong, but anyway. By this stage, both men are aware of the discoveries of Charles Darwin, whose work on the origin of the species, natural selection, and much more were, of course, unavailable to the philosophers of the Enlightenment. Marx isn't, well, of course, the Enlightenment is, we were talking about a period before Marx and Engels, if you don't know that, but in other words, it wasn't available back then, in the days of, say, Hume. But it was available to people like Marx and Engels, and in fact, Marx kind of rejected, quote-unquote, the science, as some people would say these days. By the way, there is a link to this right here. This is one page with links to all of my writings, my Culture War Encyclopedia, place where you can donate, subscribe to get my articles, and subscribe to my videos on various platforms that actually respect freedom of speech. Tabby's videos as well, Tabby's channel, and my social media is right there. So Douglas Murray continues to write, Marx is interested in Pierre Trémaux and his origin of the transformation of humans and other species. I'm pretty sure that's kind of what it would translate to, and besides, I don't know how to pronounce French anyway, so origine et transformation de l'ego et de autres êtres. Something like that. Alright. By now, the monogenesis argument, that is, that human beings are all related and are not different species, was winning the intellectual war. Frederick Douglass and others had made highly persuasive and ultimately successful interventions into the debate, and yet, even now still Marx is playing around with the polygenesis argument, as he tells Engels of Trémaux's work, quote, in spite of all the shortcomings that I have noted, it represents a very significant advance over Darwin. E.g., he spent a long time in Africa. He shows that the common Negro type is only a degeneration of a far higher one, unquote. And then there, Douglas Murray's footnote. I'll hover for a moment. Right there. Again, that's a letter 1866. Douglas goes on, perhaps this was just a blind spot for Marx. Perhaps he had a problem with black people, but not with other groups. Here is Marx in another letter to Engels, where he manages to get onto the subject of Jews. Quote, the expulsion of a leper people. Okay. Wow. He's saying they're diseased, man. Quote, the expulsion of a leper people from Egypt, at the head of whom was an Egyptian priest named Moses. Lazarus the leper is also the basic type of Jew, unquote. Wow. And there's a footnote for that quote too. Of course, there is another way in which this also could be defended. It might be said that Marx was not writing for public consumption in these letters. His reflections on the quote-unquote degenerative nature of the quote-unquote common Negro and the quote-unquote leprous nature of the Jewish people are ugly, certainly, but they are private reflections in a private letter written privately to a friend, like the letter that Thomas Jefferson sent to the Marquis de Chastellux, or whatever. But the problem with Marx is that he didn't just keep his racism to his private reflections in a private letter written privately to a friend, like the letter that Thomas Jefferson sent to the Marquis de Chastellux. But the problem with Marx is that he didn't just keep his racism to his private correspondences with his co-author of the Communist Manifesto. In 1853, one of his pieces for the New York Tribune, Marx wrote of the Balkans that it had, quote, the misfortune to be inhabited by a conglomerate of different races and nationalities of which it is hard to say which is the least fit for progress in civilization, unquote. Woo. Footnote there, folks, for that quote. Douglas Murray goes on, in 1856, he could be found writing in the same paper that, quote, we find every tyrant backed by a Jew, unquote, and claiming that there exists always, quote, a handful of Jews to ransack pockets, unquote. Starting from the time of Jesus and the throwing of the moneylenders out of the temple, Marx tells his audience that, quote, the loan-mongering Jews are so strong that it is timely and expedient to expose and stigmatize their organization, unquote. Wow. Footnote for that quote there, too. Murray goes on to write, and these proto-Hitlerian views are not from a single period of Marx's life. Rather, they are consistent throughout it. Over a decade earlier, in 1843, Marx writes in On the Jewish Question, quote, what is the worldly religion of the Jew? Huckstering. What is his worldly god? Money. Money is the jealous god of Israel, in the face of which no other god may exist, unquote. There's a footnote there for that quote. Well, you might say, perhaps Marx simply didn't like Jews very much, except that he didn't seem to like other races very much either, and had just as little respect for their great histories as he did for the history of the Jews. In 1853, he is telling his audience in America, quote, Indian society has no history at all, at least no known history, unquote. And while Marx is simultaneously damning the utterly ignorant of Indian civilization, he does seem to favor British rule of India. The quote-unquote, or quote, the question, unquote, he says, quote, is not whether the English had a right to conquer India, but whether we are to prefer India conquered by the Turk, by the Persian, by the Russian, to India conquered by the Briton, unquote. Okay? He's saying they have to be ruled over. That's what he's saying. They're too savage. One role of Britain in India, Marx asserts, is to lay, quote, the material foundations of Western society in Asia, unquote. He is inclined to think that they can do it, for although Marx notes that other civilizations had overrun India, these early barbarian conquerors, quote unquote, had been unequal to the task, whereas, quote, the British were the first conquerors, superior and therefore inaccessible to Hindu civilization, unquote. Footnote there for that quote. Superior. Yeah, it's not a nice way to speak about anybody, as Douglas Murray wrote earlier. Murray goes on to write, still, Marx may have been anti-black, anti-Semitic, anti-Indian, pro-colonialist, and racist both in public and in private, but at least he cannot be connected with the other great sin of the West. Alas, as though proving to posterity that Marx could get every issue wrong, here he is in writing about slavery in 1847, ahead of the American Civil War, and already very much on the wrong side of the conflict. Quote, slavery is an economic category like any other, unquote. Marx weighed up the bad side and what he called, quote, the good side of slavery, unquote, and he found a lot of good to say about it. Quote, without slavery, North America, the most progressive of countries, well, it's a continent, but okay, would be transformed into a patriarchal country, wipe North America off the map of the world, and you will have anarchy, the complete decay of modern commerce and civilization, cause slavery to disappear, and you will have wiped America off the map of nations, unquote. Footnote there for that. Why is it worth reeling off this incomplete list of what are, in our own era, an almost clean sweep of offenses, not simply because they demonstrate that the most significant figure in history of left-wing thought, indeed its genesis figure and prophet, perhaps even its God, was guilty of every one of the vices leveled at all non-Marxists in the West, but in any analysis, Marx was far worse than any of the people who largely leftist campaigners have spent recent years lambasting. Marx's anti-Semitism is more noxious than Immanuel Kant's. His career-long record of racism makes a single footnote in the work of David Hume look very slight. His language of superior and inferior races was a kind that progressive thinkers such as John Stuart Mill already abhorred, and worse than anything Thomas Jefferson engaged in. The only defense that might be made of him by his defenders and disciples is that he was a man of his time, that Marx lived in the 19th century and therefore held on to a number of the era's more unpleasant attributes. And yet this defense is packed with explosives waiting to go off in the face of anyone hoping to use them. First, because who is not a man of their own time? Every person whose reputation has been brought down in the Cultural Revolution of recent years was also a man or a woman of his or her own time. So why should this excuse be successful when used in defense of Marx, yet dismissed when used in defense of Voltaire or Locke? With Marx, there is another problem in his defense, which is that for his defenders, he is not simply another thinker. He is not even to be compared with Hume or the sage of Königsberg. For his followers, Marx is the last, or, depending on how you count it, the originating prophet. He was not just a thinker or a sage, he was the formulator of a world revolutionary movement. A movement that claimed to know how to reorder absolutely everything in human affairs in order to arrive at a utopian society. A utopian society that has never been achieved and has cost many millions of lives and not being achieved, but that activists across the West still dream of instituting next time. Always next time. It may be said that a prophet should be held to a higher standard than a mere philosopher, antiquarian, or botanist. In 2019, a 2019 biographer of Marx was reviewed in the New York Times under the headline, Karl Marx, Prophet of the Present. The paper's reviewer, while noting in passing some of Marx's less seemly comments about Jews, concluded that the work, quote, makes the case for taking Marx seriously today as a pragmatic realist as well as a messianic visionary. Quote, a 2019 biography of Marx was reviewed in the New York Times under the headline Karl Marx, Prophet of the Present. The paper's reviewer, while noting in passing some of Marx's less seemly comments about Jews, concluded that the work, quote, makes the case for taking Marx seriously today as a pragmatic realist as well as a messianic visionary, unquote, who, quote, never lost his belief in a redemptive future, unquote. There's a footnote there for that. Which is a beautiful idea, of course, and entirely divorced not just from every detail of the consequences, but from the reality of the man in question. What becomes clear in analyzing the differences between the treatment of Marx and the treatment of almost every other thinker of the West is that the game is worse than inconsistent. It exists to cut a swath through every thinker or historical figure in the Western tradition, to lambaste them for holding on to one or more of the attitudes of their time that our own age holds to be abhorrent, and at the same time to ensure that figures whose work is helpful in pulling apart the Western tradition, even to the point of demanding revolution to overturn it, are never treated to this same ahistorical or retributive game. Marx is protected because his writings and reputation are useful for anyone wishing to pull down the West. Everybody else is subjected to the process of destruction because their reputations are useful for holding up the West. After all, remove every other philosopher from the field, take down all their monuments and the tributes to them, and ensure that their thought is taught primarily and ahistorically as a story of racism and slavery, and what is left standing in the Western tradition. For anyone who doubts that this is the game that is being engaged in, perhaps one other example may suffice. unquote. Now, Murray then goes on to explain that the left's beloved academic Michel Foucault apparently raped marginalized people, that is, darker foreign children who were desperately poor enough to meet him in a graveyard at night for money, where he then raped them.
Lovely fella.
You want to say that a little louder, Toby?
Lovely fella, not at all somebody you want to skin and boil.
Yeah. So Murray goes on for that, and that will be relegated to the section on Michel Foucault in the Culture War Encyclopedia. Murray then notes that, quote, nowhere has there been any recantation by his disciples in disciplines across America or anywhere else because of the revelations of racially motivated child rape, unquote. There, by the way, is the Marx thing vandalized. Now you see, it's not been removed by the government. It hasn't been smashed apart. It's been spray painted. I'm not making an excuse for that, but there you go. I don't believe in mob rules, and when it comes to things like that, I think it should go through the due process if it is a just one. You know. Here is a tweet that I found. Quote: "Show your solidarity and support in the face of the recent acts of vandalism against the grave of Karl Marx by joining us in our annual oration at the grave site on 17th of March." And link to the Facebook there, and that's from 2019. So these are socialists there in the UK. And there you go. Anyway, see my upcoming entry on Michel Foucault in the Culture War Encyclopedia for more about Michel Foucault's stuff there. So subscribe, and also please share this. You can click there and click there. Do both of those, please. There you have Karl Marx and Engels right there. There's the source for that. Douglas Murray also writes on pages 182 to 183, quote, "Like the double standard over Marx's racism, this fact is suggestive, for it would surely be different if it had worked the other way around. If one of the 20th century's great conservative thinkers had been revealed to have traveled to the and by the way, Michel Foucault, this is not somebody in the 1800s. We're talking about somebody who was on TV in the 70s and the 80s. And who is and this is very important, he's very heavily cited in the soft sciences. And you can see him saying on stage or on television shows that he doesn't believe there is any such thing as right or wrong, and so basically he gives himself license to do whatever. So it really is not surprising to some people that he would engage in such acts. It may be a little surprising that he managed to get caught doing it. And this is according to someone who was close to him that this happened. Anyway, Douglas Murray, page 182, 183 in The War in the West. He writes, "Like the double standard over Marx's racism, this fact is suggestive, for it would be surely different if it had worked the other way around. If one of the 20th century's great conservative thinkers had been revealed to have been traveled to the developing world in order to rape young boys on a tombstone in a graveyard at night, it might be considered suggestive. The political left would likely be unwilling to let it slide by completely, nor would they be willing to pass up the opportunity to extrapolate some lessons. They might say that this habit was revealing of a wider conservative mindset, that it revealed pedophilic, rapist, racist tendencies at the heart of Western thought. They might even try to point out that a whole cultural movement or societal tendency was tarred by association with this nocturnal and noxious habit. But with Foucault, no such thing has happened. He remains on his throne, his work continues to spill out, and nobody to date seems to think there is anything especially telling about one of the founding icons of the anti-Westernism of our time having found personal pleasure in purchasing native children of foreign countries to satisfy his sexual desires. It is in such omissions and double standards that something crucial could be discerned, which is that what is happening in the current cultural moment is not simply an assertion of a new moral vision, but the attempted imposition of a political vision on the West, one in which only specific figures, whom the West had felt proud of, are brought low. The only figures who will still remain on their pedestals, both real and metaphorical, are those figures who were most critical of the West, meaning that the only people left to guide us would be the people who will guide us in the worst worst possible directions, unquote. And again, I have been reading, almost all of this was from Douglas Murray's War on the West, and the beginning quote from his book, same author, The Madness of Crowds, Generation Identity. So, what do you folks think? Please subscribe to this, by the way. The Culture War Encyclopedia is a separate Substack of mine. I have the Justin Trouble Substack, and then I have this one here, the Culture War Encyclopedia, which will be basically kind of like Wikipedia, but a lot better. You'll see, folks.